On the morning of December 7, 1941, the world turned on its axis. A day that began in sunlight would end in fire, and the echo of that fire would shape the century that followed. For more than 2 decades after the Great War, nations had tried to believe in peace. Europe was already burning. The Pacific trembled with ambition. Yet in the minds of most Americans, oceans were walls, not doors. They believed that war was still an ocean away. And so, as dawn came to the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the United States slept, a giant untroubled by the storm forming just beyond the horizon. The first light of Sunday spilled across Pearl Harbor like a blessing. Palm trees shimmered in the wind. Children chased each other across the lawns of Ford Island housing. From open windows drifted the smell of bacon and coffee, the hum of radios playing big band jazz. The Pacific Fleet rested in perfect order along Battleship Row. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, steel titans asleep in calm water. Seamen swept decks. Cooks cracked eggs onto sizzling pans. Engineers checked gauges that had never known panic. On the Arizona, Chaplain Howell Forgy marked pages for his morning service. No one could have imagined that within an hour those pages would scatter in flame. The air was warm, the sky a flawless blue. For the men stationed here, Hawaii was heaven, a paradise assignment before the holidays. Letters home spoke of beaches, laughter, and a sense that the world's troubles could never reach so far. Low, slow orchestral strings rise under narration. But paradise, history reminds us, is always temporary. Far to the north, the Pacific stretched unbroken for 1,000 miles. Hidden within its cold gray mists moved a fleet of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Each carried dozens of bombers and fighters, their wings painted with the red circle of the rising sun. For 10 days, the fleet had sailed in radio silence, cutting through swells that glowed ghost white in moonlight. On the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo studied the weather, the charts, and the silence. Behind him, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida reviewed his orders: to cripple America before she could stand. They were professionals, not fanatics. They believed they were striking first to secure Japan's destiny in Asia. They also knew that if the attack failed, it would doom their empire. At 3 a.m., scout planes lifted off into the darkness. Their engines were swallowed by the wind. The ocean held its breath. Back at Pearl Harbor, the sun climbed higher. Sailors on the Nevada gathered at the rail to watch colors rise. The band aboard the Arizona prepared for the day's flag-raising ceremony. Trumpets gleamed. Polished brass caught the light like mirrors. In officers' quarters, typewriters clacked as clerks filled out reports. Mechanics at Hickam Field tested engines for training flights. A single B-17 bomber approached the islands from California, carrying mail and supplies, a symbol of connection, not threat. From every angle, it was a morning that promised nothing but peace. Pause. The ambiance shifts to deeper tone. Yet history is cruelly precise. It chooses its moments with quiet confidence. Every smile, every routine, every heartbeat that morning, all existed on borrowed time. At 6:10 a.m., aboard the Akagi, Fuchida raised a single arm and gave the signal. Engines ignited one by one, their rumble breaking the dawn. From the decks of 6 carriers rose 183 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes climbing into the light. They flew low, over empty ocean, their shadows racing across the waves. On Oahu, radar operators at Opana Station detected something strange. A massive formation of planes, 80 miles out, approaching fast. They phoned headquarters. The duty officer listened, frowned, and said, "Don't worry about it. Probably B-17s from the mainland." Then he hung up. That single assumption would cost more lives than anyone could imagine. By 7:30 a.m., church bells were ringing. Some sailors attended Sunday service. Others cleaned their rifles or wrote in journals. On the flight line at Wheeler Field, pilots stood laughing near their parked planes, joking about golf scores. To the east, the sky shimmered gold. To the north, faint specks appeared, too small, too distant to stir fear. The world still belonged to peace for 10 more minutes. At 7:49, Fuchida opened his radio and spoke a single word 3 times. Tora, tora, tora! The code meant complete surprise. The tiger had leapt. A long, deep pause, then the faint sound of approaching engines, barely audible. Narrator lower. In less than a quarter of an hour, the Pacific would ignite. And the course of human history, the rise of empires, the birth of the atomic age, the very balance of power, would pivot on this quiet harbor. December 7th, 1941. A morning like any other. A morning that changed the world. For one suspended instant, the harbor holds its breath. A gull wheels above Battleship Row. A flag flutters against a sky so clean it feels untouchable. Then the horizon fractures. Dark shapes descend with predatory certainty, wings flashing, bellies opening, gravity tugging steel toward steel. The first bomb falls like a verdict. The morning shatters. A column of water leaps beside the West Virginia. On the Oklahoma, men spin toward the glare, eyes narrowing, instinct searching for a pattern that will make sense of the impossible. There is none. The second bomb lands closer, a hard white flash and a halo of splinters. Bodies lunge for ladders, for shoes, for the idea of cover that does not exist on an open deck. Orders bark out of throats that have never shaped these words in this place. To stations, move. Over Ford Island, torpedo planes skim so low their shadows crease the water. The harbor becomes a geometry of intent, long, straight wakes arrowing toward the anchored battleships, pilots drawing lines the ships cannot avoid. A torpedo kisses the hull of the West Virginia, then hammers inward with a force that drives through water, into iron, into everything living behind it. Another slams the Oklahoma. She groans, rolls, groans again, as if trying to refuse physics. Inside her, corridors tilt, bunks become walls. Daylight turns into a jagged, sliding rectangle. On the Arizona, heads tilt skyward, then down toward the open hatches where ammunition is stacked neat as a promise. A bomb penetrates near turret 2 and vanishes below like a seed into soil. For a half breath, nothing happens. Then the ship erupts from within, a volcano in reverse. The blast splits time. A red-gold sphere blossoms, swallows mast and metal and men, then pours upward into a stalk of smoke that writes itself across the morning. Fragments of deck plate tumble end over end. Paper whirls through the fire like birds that lost their way. Across the harbor, men run. Boots strike steel, clang on ladders, slide on oil. A gun crew that has trained 1,000 times without urgency now finds their hands sure. Breach, shell, slam, elevate. A loader watches the tracer arc stitch the air and wills it to find the tiny darting shapes above. The ones that bank and flash and return so quickly, he begins to believe the sky is making them anew. The air thickens with particles. Paint dust, cordite, ash, salt. Throats burn, eyes water. Every breath feels like swallowing a fistful of nails. At Hickam and Wheeler Fields, aircraft are parked wingtip to wingtip, a tidy peacetime habit that the attackers exploit without mercy. Bullets rake aluminum like fingernails across a tin roof. A young pilot sprints toward a P-40, a shape in motion against a backdrop of parked, burning silhouettes. He reaches the ladder and climbs with the movements of someone who has forgotten he owns a body. The prop coughs, catches, gathers a rhythm. Another strafing past chews the runway open in front of him. He holds the throttle anyway, because the idea of staying on the ground feels smaller and more certain than death. The Nevada begins to move, slow at first, a massive will translating into water. She heaves against the harbor's inertia, a battleship deciding not to die where she was left. Pilots pick her out and agree without speaking. Stop that one. Bombs tumble in a staggered string, walking their way toward her deck. She lists, takes on water, keeps going. Smoke clots around her superstructure, then thins, then thickens again. She will not quit until the channel itself becomes the enemy. On the Oklahoma, the roll is permanent now. Inside, the floor is a wall. Men punch at hatches that were never meant to be opened upside down. Hands slam wrenches into hinges, bang knuckles into rivets, count the seconds between strikes as if there is a rhythm to survival. Above them, a battleship turns turtle, a mountain made liquid, a map redrawn in 10 minutes by forces with no patience for maps. The harbor itself transforms. Oil slicks break loose and spread, rippling with iridescent colors beneath a skin of ash. Fire finds the oil as if they had an appointment. Flames race with the wind, kiss the water into steam, pull shape out of smoke. Men in the water struggle against a surface now layered with burning. Some dive under, count to 10, push up for one panicked breath, then dive again, seeking pockets of clean in a sea that has turned enemy. Rescue begins inside the disaster. A launch noses toward a writhing patch of water where 3 heads bob in and out of the oil. Hands reach, miss, reach again, catch a sleeve. On the Maryland, a corpsman wraps a bandage around an arm that used to be a whole arm and whispers the first true thing of the day. Hold on. A chaplain moves along a line of bodies with a purpose that cannot be practiced, his lips shaping words older than war. Anti-aircraft guns harden into a rhythm. Mounts that were decorative in peacetime become vertebrae in a new spine. The gunners are sweating now, shirts torn open, fingers black with powder. They have learned the angles of these attack runs. Their tracers begin to meet the enemy at those angles. A zero falls. For a moment, it is beautiful. Pure motion tearing free of purpose. Then it hits the harbor and vanishes like a thought you didn't want to lose. Above Battleship Row, dive bombers roll inverted and drop through their own wake, screaming down the sun lines toward their chosen rectangles of steel. Bomb cradles empty. The aircraft kick upward, lighter by 1 fate each. Below, the bombs walk along decks, step off edges, fall into the harbor, or find a magazine and rewrite the physics of a morning. Every hit creates new weather. Heat, wind, pressure, rain that is not rain. A runner crosses from one deck to the next on a gangway that rocks like a bridge in a dream. He carries no message, just momentum. Behind him, a burst claws the gangway apart, a final punctuation that makes his leap both ridiculous and correct. He lands on the far deck and keeps running because stopping has become something only other men can do. On Ford Island, a window blows outward in a perfect rectangle, a portrait frame with no picture. Papers lift, wander, settle. In a yard, a tricycle lies on its side, its front wheel spinning toward an angle it will never quite reach. A dog barks and then does not. Across the bay, hangar doors bow inward, torn by a blast that leaves the building standing and everything inside it uncertain of names. Time warps, seconds swell and thin. For some, the attack lasts an hour of 20 years. For others, the attack is a series of flashes separated by blank, tall rooms of silence. Memory fractures into photographs, the way a man's hat lifts from his head as he runs, the way paint peels in long, elegant curls from heat, the way sunlight continues, indifferent to strike a railing as if it had been told nothing of fire. The second wave arrives. The sky remakes itself into attack lanes and evasions. Some of the defenders are better now. They track lead instead of shape, go for the angle instead of the shadow. Others are tired in a way that feels like a future they cannot endure. The harbor's voice has changed. Even the explosions sound resigned, as if noise itself has run out of novel ways to speak. A medic pauses over a wounded sailor whose eyes are fixed on something behind the medic's shoulder. The medic turns. Across the water, the Arizona still burns, an open wound too bright to look at for long. The medic turns back, sets his jaw, and moves to the next man because that is the only direction left. By late morning, the attack begins to fray. The raiders peel away, counting planes and fuel, heads swiveling for threats that multiply the longer they remain. The harbor is a palimpsest of smoke and steam. Ships emerge and vanish as if the day itself is uncertain which story it will keep. Somewhere, a bandmaster gathers his men and says nothing at all. They lift instruments with hands that shake and begin to play a hymn no one can hear over the last trailing detonations. Still, they play, because the opposite of chaos is a choice. On the edge of the channel, the Nevada lists and settles, stubborn to the end, a statement carved into water. We moved. A signalman, face black, whites of his eyes startling, raises flags he cannot quite focus on. He holds them anyway, because once the body learns a thing, it prefers to do it even when the world has ended. When the final attackers tip their wings and turn for the open Pacific, the harbor does not return to quiet. It inhales smoke and exhales names. Triage blooms in every patch of open shade. Lines of stretchers appear as if grown from the ground. Boats shuttle between ships as if stitching a wound that refuses to close. And in the exhausted noon, an accounting begins. Not numbers yet. Those will come later, solemn and insufficient. An accounting of what remains. A ring pried from a finger and wrapped in gauze, a photograph in a wallet, edges singed, a ship's bell mute against charred wood, a hymn half remembered, a harbor that will carry the smell of this morning into the bones of anyone who breathes beside it, forever. The day is not over, but the shape of the century has changed. Across the continent, a president's pen will soon find the words that history will memorize. Across an ocean, a fleet will celebrate a victory that already contains its ending. Here, on water that still boils in places, men lift other men and learn the first rule of the new world. Stand, carry, try again. The attack has ended. The war has begun. The roar faded, but silence never came. What followed the attack was not quiet. It was the long scream of a harbor trying to breathe through fire. Smoke rose in black pillars that joined the clouds. The air burned with oil and salt, and the sea, once calm and blue, had turned to molten gray, carrying fragments of steel, bodies, and flame. Everywhere, men moved through the haze as if trapped inside a waking nightmare. Ships that had stood side by side that morning were now twisted skeletons. The Arizona was gone, still burning, its bow half submerged. The Oklahoma lay on her side, a mountain of metal and death. On the West Virginia, sailors clawed at torn bulkheads, their knuckles bleeding, their mouths full of smoke. Those who survived the blasts now fought the water, the fire, and the weight of disbelief. A small boat cut across the harbor, weaving between walls of flame. Aboard it were medics and sailors who had jumped from their own decks to save others. They rode through oil slicks that had caught fire, the oars hissing each time they broke the surface. One man leaned over, pulling another from the water, his hands blackened, his uniform torn to ribbons. There were no orders left to follow, only instinct. Bodies floated face down in the harbor, their white uniforms stained black. The smell of burning fuel mixed with flesh and salt. Every direction looked like the center of the explosion. Near the Nevada, where the fires were heaviest, groups of men worked to free those trapped below. They hammered at steel with anything they could find: wrenches, rifles, their own fists. From inside the hull came the dull, rhythmic sound of men answering the rescue, banging back. "We are here. Don't stop." On Ford Island, medics turned hangars into hospitals. They tore bed sheets into bandages and used seawater to wash wounds. There were too many. Some lay on the floor, whispering for morphine, for water, for home. Others lay still, their dog tags clinking against the concrete when someone moved past. A nurse, her face streaked with ash, guided two orderlies carrying a stretcher. "Lay him there," she said, though there was no space left. The man on the stretcher was still breathing, eyes glassy, one arm gone. She knelt, took his other hand, and held it until it went cold. No one cried. There was no time to cry. The heat was everywhere, a constant, invisible pressure. On the decks of the California and Maryland, fires flared again and again. Ammunition cooked off in bursts, each one a new alarm. Hoses snaked across the wreckage, spraying arcs of seawater that turned to steam before they landed. A chief petty officer shouted above the noise, "Get those guns out of the fire!" "Get them moving." The men obeyed. Not because anyone still expected another wave, but because action was the only way to stand against despair. They worked until their skin blistered. They carried hoses, pulled bodies, fought for air in a harbor that had forgotten what air was. By midday, the fires began to settle into slow, awful persistence. The sky above Oahu had turned to a lid of gray. Ash fell like snow. Fine, weightless, endless. It coated faces, decks, and the open palms of men too exhausted to wipe it away. Groups formed without command. Sailors, Marines, civilians, everyone pulling in the same direction. Boats became ambulances. A church became a morgue. Every patch of land that wasn't burning was carrying someone who was. Across the harbor, a young ensign stood staring at what used to be the Arizona. He counted explosions without realizing he was counting. He whispered the names of friends until his voice gave out. The flag above the base was still there, tattered, smoke-streaked, but upright. It looked wrong and right all at once. In the late afternoon, rescue teams still searched the overturned hull of the Oklahoma. From within, faint tapping continued, a code of life that grew weaker as daylight faded. Welders brought torches, cutting through steel while others listened with stethoscopes pressed against the hull. Each clang of metal was an echo of both hope and doom. Nearby, a chaplain stood with his head bowed. His lips moved silently. He had no sermon left, only the rhythm of prayer. By sunset, the harbor was quieter, but only because the noise had burned itself out. The fires were still alive, glowing red inside black clouds. The ships that had survived stood like ghosts, their hulls reflecting firelight, their flags motionless. Men sat on the decks in silence, staring at the smoke drifting westward, toward the open Pacific, where the enemy had come and gone. For some, the worst part had begun, the waiting for the night, the knowing that friends were still trapped below, the smell that would not leave. The morning of December 8, 1941, came slowly, as if the sun itself was uncertain whether to rise. Across America, dawn crept through curtains and over silent streets. Radios still hummed from the night before, their static voices repeating words that had already carved themselves into memory. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Newspapers, damp with dew, lay on porches untouched. Headlines shouted in thick black letters, disbelief frozen in ink. In Washington, D.C., the air was brittle with winter cold. Men in long coats hurried along the avenues, newspapers tucked under their arms. Some walked in silence, others stopped beneath street lamps to read again, as if the truth might change with daylight. In kitchens across the country, breakfast cooled on plates. Mothers stood at radios with dishcloths hanging forgotten in their hands. Children watched their fathers tie shoes more tightly. The small domestic sounds of mourning replaced by something heavier, the beginning of resolve. America was awake now, but it was the kind of awakening that came not with alarm, but with realization that history had turned and there would be no turning back. By mid-morning, a line had already begun to form outside the recruitment offices. It started with a few men in worn jackets and pressed hats, then grew until it curled around the block, a living testament to decision. Some were veterans of the last war, gray at the temples but steady in posture. Others were boys who had never left their hometowns, their hands rough from fields or factories, gripping their birth certificates like passports to a future they didn't yet understand. They didn't talk much. The sound of shoes on pavement was enough, a rhythm that carried the same meaning from coast to coast. In cities and towns, posters went up overnight. "We need you. Enlist today." By noon, recruitment centers were overflowing. In school gyms and courthouse halls, typewriters clacked like small drums of purpose. Young men filled forms, answered questions, rolled up sleeves for physical exams, and accepted envelopes stamped with orders. Outside, mothers waited with folded coats and unread tears. The nation that had been a spectator of war was now a participant. The stillness that followed shock was gone, replaced by movement, by hands, pens, and hearts ready to act. At noon, the air in Washington thickened with purpose. The Capitol steps filled until the marble itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Inside the chamber, men and women crowded shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the dais where history was about to find its voice. Franklin D. Roosevelt wheeled forward beneath the white glare of chandeliers. He unfolded his notes with deliberate calm, the movement of a man who already knew the weight of every word he was about to speak. When he began, the silence in the room seemed to lean closer. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. The words cut through the air like clean steel. A date which will live in infamy. Each syllable struck not like oratory, but like truth-taking shape. The chamber held its breath. There was no applause, no hesitation, only gravity. Across the nation, radios carried that same voice into living rooms, barbershops, factories, and schoolrooms. People stopped whatever they were doing, forks halfway to mouths, hammers frozen mid-swing. The president's words became more than speech. They became an oath shared by millions. When it ended, there were no cheers, only a single collective exhale, the sound of a nation accepting its new reality. In the days that followed, the rhythm of America changed. The hum of peace, radios, traffic, chatter, gave way to a deeper, heavier sound. The awakening of industry. In Detroit, the first sparks of welding torches lit the dawn like lightning trapped in steel. Assembly lines that had once built cars began to shed their skins. Design tables were cleared of blueprints for sedans and replaced with aircraft wings, tank treads, and bomber fuselages. Men and women, engineers and machinists, moved with a unity born of urgency. In shipyards from California to Virginia, cranes swung overhead like slow, deliberate giants. Steel plates slammed into place, rivets were driven with rhythmic precision. Each strike of the hammer was an act of defiance, a promise that destruction would be answered with creation. Factories worked without pause. Lunch breaks shortened, shifts doubled, and new workers arrived daily, many of them women wearing coveralls and bandanas, their hands blackened with oil and determination. America was no longer waiting for war. It was building one. In the hours after the fires of Pearl Harbor dimmed, the Pacific Command turned from disbelief to resolve. The radio lines that had fallen silent now crackled back to life, carrying clipped voices across thousands of miles of ocean. Messages came coded, urgent, fragmented, coordinates, losses, orders. In underground bunkers and dimly lit operations rooms, officers stood over maps pinned with colored flags. The Pacific, once a vast expanse of calm blue, now looked like a chessboard in chaos. Each red mark was a wound, each white flag, a question that had to be answered with steel. At Pearl, Admiral Chester Nimitz received his first briefings amid the wreckage. The faces around him were ash gray, uniforms torn, but their eyes were fixed forward. There was no time for mourning, only movement. The fleet was crippled, yes, but not broken. The words passed quietly among officers. We will rebuild. We will strike back. America had not been defeated. It had been awakened. Before the smoke had cleared in Hawaii, the Pacific was already shifting. From San Diego to Midway, ships that had escaped the attack began to move like pieces on a new board, cautious, silent, but determined. Destroyers, submarines, and cruisers slipped from their docks at night, engines low, their wakes cutting through black water that smelled of salt and iron. At naval air stations, mechanics worked without pause. Aircraft were patched, fueled, and armed under floodlights. Pilots stood beside their planes, eyes red from sleepless nights, waiting for orders that hadn't yet come but would soon change the course of the ocean. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's staff scanned the horizon for signs of movement. The Japanese advance was spreading fast, each island a stepping stone toward dominance. But now the tide had started to shift, not yet visible but inevitable. The Pacific itself seemed to awaken, its vastness no longer a barrier but a battlefield. One America would learn to master through fire and will. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose the rhythm of rebuilding. In shipyards along the California coast, sparks fell like rain. Welders in goggles carved light through darkness, their torches stitching together the bones of a new fleet. Every clang of steel was a heartbeat, slow, heavy, defiant. Training grounds erupted across the country. Fields that had been empty for decades were transformed overnight into barracks and runways. Recruits marched through mud, rifles on shoulders, voices hoarse from oaths shouted into winter wind. They were farmers, clerks, and students yesterday, soldiers today. In the air, the hum of new engines began to echo. The first waves of P-40 Warhawks and B-17 bombers took flight, tracing lines of hope through a gray sky. Every new takeoff carried more than metal. It carried a promise that the Pacific would one day see American wings again. And somewhere across the ocean, the enemy listened, hearing, perhaps for the first time, the sound of a nation reforging itself in the fires it had endured. By spring of 1942, the ocean that had carried smoke and sorrow now carried resolve. From the decks of freshly repaired carriers, pilots gathered beneath the hum of engines and the smell of fuel and salt. They spoke little. Their faces were young, but their eyes already carried the weight of those who had seen too much. In April, the first counterstrike took shape, a plan whispered across command tables and sealed in courage. It would not win the war, but it would prove that America could strike back. 16 B-25 bombers rolled across the deck of the USS Hornet, their wings trembling above the Pacific swells. Men stood along the rails, watching as each aircraft lifted into gray sky, heavy, slow, impossible. They were headed for Tokyo. When the first bombs fell on Japanese soil, the echo was more than sound, it was the rebirth of will. It told the world that distance was no shield, and that Pearl Harbor had not broken the giant, it had woken it. Across the Pacific, in barracks, shipyards, and homes, men and women lifted their heads for the first time in months. The counterblow had begun, and with it the long road toward victory. The Pacific no longer whispered. By early 1942, it spoke in frequencies and coded transmissions, its silence replaced by the chatter of strategy. In dim war rooms beneath, the White House and in naval stations, from San Francisco to Pearl, maps of the Pacific sprawled across tables like battlefields still waiting to be drawn. Commanders bent over charts where small pins marked more than positions. They marked intentions. Each move was a question of distance, weather, and nerve. The Japanese Empire, stretched across half the ocean, still seemed unstoppable. But the United States, learning fast, had begun to think not like the wounded mess, but like hunters. In a bunker at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz studied radio intercepts from a handful of cryptologists, men who listened for ghosts inside static. They had begun to catch fragments of Japanese signals, whispers of a new offensive forming somewhere in the Central Pacific. The enemy's next move was coming, and this time America would be ready. Aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown gathered in secret harbors, their decks alive with new aircraft and new hope. The men who served aboard them had no illusions left. They knew the enemy's precision. They had seen what the rising sun could do. Now, they waited to strike back. The storm was coming, and America, newly armed and newly awake, had learned how to listen to the wind. In late May 1942, every compass in the Pacific seemed to point toward a single name: Midway. A small atoll, barely a speck on the ocean, now carried the weight of two empires. In the cryptographic rooms at Pearl Harbor, the hum of typewriters mixed with the click of decoding machines. The men of Station Hypo had done the impossible. They had cracked enough of Japan's naval code to know what was coming. The enemy would strike at Midway, and for the first time since the war began, the United States would not be surprised. Admiral Nimitz issued his orders with calm precision. The fleet would move, quietly, invisibly, to intercept. Carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown were sent to sea, their decks stacked with aircraft, their crews briefed with just enough truth to understand the risk. In the ready rooms, pilots studied reconnaissance photos by lamplight. They traced enemy routes on thin sheets of acetate, memorizing bearings and squadrons that, by week's end, would either be history or ghosts. The tension was electric. The Pacific had gone still again, not peaceful, but waiting. Somewhere beyond that endless horizon, two fleets were moving toward each other, guided by skill, chance, and fate. June 4th, 1942. Dawn broke over the Pacific like a blade of light, sharp, thin, and merciless. Both fleets had found each other. What began as dots on radar now became shapes in the sky and shadows on the horizon. The Japanese carriers advanced in perfect formation, their decks a choreography of precision. Engines roared to life, propellers spun, and bombers launched into the wind with mechanical grace. Below, sailors moved with rehearsed discipline, unaware that the world had already tilted against them. On the American side, carrier decks trembled as squadrons scrambled for takeoff. Pilots ran through smoke and exhaust, climbed into cockpits still warm from the sun, and waited for the launch signal, a nod, a hand, and the world dropping away beneath them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying into history. The first attacks came fast and chaotic. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, their sirens cutting through the roar of the ocean. Explosions rolled across the Japanese fleet, and in moments fire leapt from deck to sky. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became infernos, pillars of smoke twisting upward like black banners announcing a shift in destiny. On the radio, the code words came through clear, scratch 3 carriers. It was the sound of balance returning to the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was not just a fight, it was a statement. The tide had turned, and the Pacific, for the first time, belonged to neither silence nor fear, but to the rising echo of American defiance. When the fires of Midway finally died, the ocean was silent again. But it was a different silence now, not of defeat, but of awakening. The Japanese fleet withdrew into the mist, leaving behind 4 carriers smoldering beneath the waves. For the first time, the rising sun had set on its own empire. And for the first time, America looked across the Pacific and saw not an endless sea, but a path forward. In Honolulu, news of the victory spread like a pulse through every barracks, hospital, and harbor. Men who had fought at Pearl Harbor stood together on docks, staring at the horizon that had once betrayed them. Some saluted, some wept. Most simply stood, breathing the air of a world that suddenly felt possible again. Factories cheered in their own language, steel against steel, engines roaring to life. Shipyards sang with the rhythm of new beginnings. From classrooms to fields, from mothers' kitchens to military mess halls, a single thought began to take shape. We can win this. The tide had turned, not because of luck, but because will had outlasted fear. And across the Pacific, beneath the same sky that had once burned with fire, the United States Navy sailed east, toward a future written not in surrender, but in strength. Victory had come, but it did not feel like peace. In the weeks after Midway, the Pacific was still a graveyard, only now it belonged to no one. Ships drifted across open water carrying scars instead of cargo. Every sailor knew that Midway was not the end of war, but the beginning of a longer one. In Washington, strategy meetings stretched late into the night. Maps of the Pacific sprawled across polished tables, islands circled in red pencil. Each name unfamiliar, each one a future battlefield. The word Guadalcanal began to surface again and again, first as a whisper, then as an objective. If America was to stop Japan's expansion, it had to seize the initiative, and that island was the key. Orders went out in coded transmissions. Convoys began to assemble under cover of night. Transports, destroyers, carriers, all bound for an island no one had seen. But everyone would soon remember. Supplies were loaded in haste, crates of ammunition, fuel, rations, and the most important cargo of all. Men who did not yet understand what awaited them. The Pacific had changed its shape. The ocean that once separated continents was now a corridor of war, and every mile forward meant blood. Guadalcanal. The first wave hit the beaches at dawn. August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. For the Marines, it was not a grand invasion, but a test of endurance. The jungle met them with heat and silence, the kind that hides eyes behind leaves. Every step into the green was a wager against the unseen. They found the airfield half-built, abandoned by fleeing workers. Henderson Field, that was its name, soon to be written into legend. It was little more than dirt and steel, but it was everything. Whoever held that strip of land would control the skies over the Solomon Islands. The first Japanese counterattacks came at night. Gunfire cracked through the rain, tracer rounds slicing through the black canopy. Men fired at shadows and prayed they were aiming the right way. The nights lasted forever. And when dawn came, it revealed nothing but smoke, mud, and exhaustion. Offshore, the sea burned again. American ships and Japanese destroyers hunted each other through darkness. The water glowed with fire and oil, littered with wreckage that drifted for days. The Marines called it Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of steel and courage. For 6 months, the battle dragged on, hunger, malaria, and rain claiming as many lives as bullets did. And yet, they held, against everything they held. On Guadalcanal, America learned not just how to fight, but how to endure. By October, Guadalcanal had become more than a battle. It was a siege. Every day, the Japanese attacked by air, sea, and jungle, and every night they came again. The Marines called it the Tokyo Express, made of fast destroyers, that slipped in under moonlight, firing shells and vanishing before dawn. Supplies ran low. Ammunition was counted by the bullet, food by the spoonful. Rainwater collected in helmets became worth more than whiskey. Men fought hunger, fever, and fear in equal measure. In the air, the Cactus Air Force, a handful of American planes operating from the muddy strip of Henderson Field, fought until engines coughed dry. They flew on instinct, outnumbered and exhausted, defending a sky that seemed to belong to the enemy. Each landing was a gamble between life and the sea. On the ground, foxholes turned into homes. Letters from home arrived wet and unreadable, but men kept them anyway, folded in pockets, pressed to hearts. They stopped asking when they would leave. They only asked if they would hold, and they did. Against the jungle, the night, and an enemy that refused to yield, they held the line. Not because they were unafraid, but because they refused to let go. When the guns finally went quiet on Guadalcanal, the silence did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. The island, once green and alive, was now a wasteland of mud, twisted trees and rusted steel. Bodies lay half-buried where the jungle had tried to reclaim them. And yet the American flag still flew above Henderson Field. The cost had been unthinkable. Thousands dead, thousands more wounded, their names written in mud and memory. But through that sacrifice, something else had been born: knowledge. America had learned the rhythm of the Pacific War, the tide, the jungle, the night, and the will of an enemy that would rather die than surrender. In the months that followed, the Marines and sailors who survived were redeployed: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte. Each battle would carry the lessons of Guadalcanal: dig deep, strike fast, never assume the enemy is gone. In Washington, strategists rewrote the maps again, arrows now pointing westward, not to hold, but to advance. The war that began in chaos had found its order. The enemy that once moved unchecked now fought to defend what it had taken. The Pacific was vast, still cruel, but it had changed. It now echoed with engines, not silence. And in those engines lived the promise that every inch lost would one day be reclaimed.